Hello and welcome to The World This Week. I'm Gavin Lee. You're joining us live in Paris, as always, every Friday, where we discuss the world's most pressing current affairs issues with four distinguished correspondents. In a week where President Trump played fast and loose with world markets and his global tariff threats became a reality with brutal and immediate economic fallout, dozens of countries reached out to negotiate, or as Trump described it, begged, pleaded to have the import taxes on supposed friends and foes removed. We also saw supposed friends within the Trump administration become public foes. As Elon Musk called trade advisor Pete Navarro dumb on the sack of BRICS, Musk did swiftly apologise to the BRICS. And while Washington's brinkmanship with Beijing remained, the rest of the world was given a partial reprieve of 90 days.
Well, I thought that people were jumping a little bit out of line. They were getting yippy, They were getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid.
It's a week that's seen the end of 5 months of political limbo in Europe's biggest economy. Germany's government has been stuck in neutral since the coalition collapsed in November. But after winning February's election, the Chancellor-to-be, Friedrich Merz, has at last struck a deal between his centre-right party and the centre-left Social Democrats. But there's been a timely reminder of the thin ice the new coalition is skating on. A poll released this week shows the far-right AfD in ascendancy. It's now regarded for the first time as the country's most popular party.
The key message to Donald Trump is Germany is back on track. Germany will fulfill the obligations in terms of defense, and Germany is willing to strengthen their own competitiveness.
It's been a week that's seen the United Arab Emirates brought to the International Court of Justice, accused of complicity in genocide in Sudan. In the middle of a civil war, the Sudanese military rulers are accusing the UAE of providing direct financial and political support to Sudan's rival faction, the Rapid Support Force, and claiming in doing so, Doha has enabled the RSF to carry out widespread atrocities in Darfur, claims the UAE deny.
The direct logistic and other support that the UAE has provided and continue to provide it to the RSF and their affiliated militia has been continue to be the primary driving force behind genocide now taking place.
Well, the esteemed panellists joining me on the programme tonight, we have from Nairobi, the New York Times chief Africa correspondent Declan Walsh. Declan, it is fantastic to have you with us tonight. Thank you. You and the New York Times photojournalist Ivan Prickett became the first Western journalist to report from inside Khartoum in recent days, the first time since the civil war broke out almost 2 years ago. We're going to talk about that in detail later in the programme, but let's take a look, first of all, at some of your work there. This is your description of the scenes you encountered.
Sudanese military has sought to consolidate its recent gains and push the Rapid Support Forces from the presidential palace, a hugely symbolic prize now heavily destroyed. We visited the palatial villa of the RSF deputy leader, where Sudanese soldiers were keeping guard beside his empty pool or working out in his gym. Nearby was another deserted home belonging to Sudan's former civilian prime minister, who was overthrown in a coup in 2021. We didn't stay long. Soldiers warned us that RSF snipers could see us from their positions across the river, about 500 metres away.
Declan, you and your team at the New York Times won the George Polk Award for War Reporting last year. It honours the commitment to exposing critical stories under dangerous conditions. So you've been expelled from Pakistan, you've escaped arrest in Egypt. When you compare this assignment in Sudan, how difficult is it to tell the story?
Well, it's very challenging to get into the country. And as you can see from some of that footage, until very recently, Khartoum was an active war zone, probably one of the largest in Africa, if not in the world. The footage that you just saw there was taken some weeks ago when the Sudanese military was in the middle of this assault as they tried to seize control back of this city that they effectively almost entirely lost at the start of the year, at the start of the war 2 years ago. And about 10 days ago, they succeeded. They pushed across the river They captured the presidential palace, which was heavily damaged. And since then, they have continued to sweep across the rest of the city and push the rapid support forces out of the capital.
Declan, great to have you with us and to hear more from you as well about your time inside Khartoum. Let's move from Nairobi. Let's go to Scandinavia. Let's bring in Ola Ryberg, long-time EU correspondent for Danish public broadcaster Danish Radio, DR. Ola, great to see you. Thank you for being with us. Now, you're covering EU affairs at a time that Denmark has been front and centre of global affairs, headlines with Trump threats of taking Greenland. There are leaders being defined by this, aren't there, right now, his presidency. How do you think Denmark's statsminister, Mette Frederiksen, is being seen to handle the challenge?
Well, if you look at the polls, you can definitely see that her popularity has increased. You can also see that her party is the party's popularity is increasing, and all in all, what you can see in Denmark, if you look at the polls, is that you are down to less or around like only 1 in 5 Danes who now see the US as an ally. And this coming from a country that used to be one of the staunchest allies of the United States. So it's really challenging and changing times in Denmark.
I mentioned your time covering Brussels. It is a long time. If we take a look quickly at your social media, Ola, and your profile, this is your wall of press accreditations that we can see behind. This is something of a museum piece, Ola, given they've been building up since, what, 1988, late 80s, when the EU was still the EEC, a club of 12 countries. Now, you've seen countries come and one go, no names. In all of that time, what is the question you think you're most asked about the EU?
Oh, Jesus. Well, it goes back to 88, so at the time when we didn't have any internet and you were actually phoning your stories home, and there were typewriters in the press room, so it makes me both feel and look very old. I think that one of the stories I've been asked, I mean, since 88, when I covered my first summit, and through the time, and now once again with the tariff war going on, is can European unity remain, or is Europe going to fall apart? That is the question when Brexit happens, now again with Trump's trade war, when the Berlin Wall fell. So I'm kind of getting a bit tired of getting that question about whether European unity will stand. So I will challenge you whether you dare asking that again tonight.
Do you think European unity will stand, Ola? I won't, I promise.
I do think it will.
OK, well, great to have you, Ola, with us. Alongside us as well, Agnès Poirier, a friend of the programme, broadcaster, renowned writer, award-winning writer of The Left Bank, Art, Paris, Rebirth of Paris, 1940 to 1950. Also, Notre Dame, the soul of France. Agnès, brilliant to have you with us. And the last time I saw you, just completed a fantastic series for the BBC on Notre Dame. Tell us about what you've been working on of late.
Well, yesterday I went to the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, most historic museum, and I was given this lovely commission. It happens sometimes. I had to review that exhibition of Agnès Varda, the French film director, who also started her career as a photographer. And it's Paris in the late 1940s, 1950s, and it's wonderful. It's small, but perfectly shaped little exhibition to go and see in Paris this week and until August. But I've also been covering Marine Le Pen's sentencing, of course. Slightly less lovely subject.
Very interesting that you were both, let's bring in Lisa Lewis as well, because you're both of you covering this case in the last few days. We're going to talk about Marine Le Pen. We're going to talk about the early sort of starting blocks for the presidency as well, different names coming out. But let me introduce seasoned Paris-based independent journalist Lisa Lewis, seen on Deutsche Welle, seen on the BBC, NPR, amongst others. Great to have you with us. You've been covering Le Pen. Also this week, you've been looking at the rearmament programme for Europe and how France is trying to take centre stage.
Yes, absolutely. I've been looking at how France, the French defence sector, could be the backbone, or actually is the backbone of the European defence industry, because there's this war culture, as people have been calling it, that has been maintained since the 1960s. The government very aware of the fact that they need to have a very strong defense sector, as opposed to countries like my home country, Germany, where I myself have grown up with a certain idea of pacifism and that we don't need a strong army anymore.
Very interesting. We're going to talk about Germany as well. Very interesting comments today coming from Russian state media, talking about this whole rearm Europe propaganda, putting out there that it's going to rearm Germany. We're going to see what they call the Fourth Reich. So that gives you an idea of the kind of messaging going on from Kremlin-controlled media right now. Lisa Lewis, great that you're on the programme as well. Let's begin, because throughout this week, morning, noon, night, whether you turned on the TV, radio, read a news app, scrolled socials, one theme that's dominated in the past 7 days and could well dominate the next 7, it is President Trump's tariff plan and the effect it's having on the world stage. What financial analysts are describing as cliff edge economics, aka slapping high import tax on products coming from nearly every country, and more for those considered by the White House as the worst offenders. Let's take you back to Saturday. A baseline tariff of 10% came into effect. Thousands of companies, including America's biggest, Apple, Amazon, Nike, who rely on imports, saw their costs soar. Investors panicked, worried profits would dry up. They started to sell stocks. Trillions of dollars in stock was wiped off the value of companies. Markets in Europe, in Asia, hit record lows too. Inflation, recession fears kicked in. Stay calm, don't respond, warned Trump. More than 70 countries were begging for an audience, pleading for him to stop, he said, in less diplomatic terms.
These countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir.
There was less kissing and more retaliatory kicking from Beijing, who imposed their own higher tariffs. And as things stand, the US has put a 145% import tax on Chinese goods, more than the price of the product itself and some more. China says it's fighting back, imposing a 125% tariff the other way. And their spokesperson on foreign affairs invoking the spirit of suffering during Mao's China and said there will be no surrender.
如果美方置两国和国际社会的利益于不顾，执意打关税战、贸易战，中方必将奉陪到底。
Then, out of the blue, Wednesday afternoon in Washington, President Trump announced that while the 10% base rate still applies, there would be a partial tariff pause for 90 days for all except Beijing, that is.
That people were jumping a little bit out of line. They were getting yippy, you know. They were getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid, unlike these champions, because we have a big job to do. No other president would have done what I did. No other president. I know the presidents, they wouldn't have done it.
So it leaves Washington and Beijing slugging it out, two countries that account for just shy of half of the global economy. Ola, what's your take and reading of this week's events?
Well, basically, if you look at it, the rest of the world really didn't have to do a lot to get Trump to adjust his tariff policy. Wall Street did the job for the rest of the world. And now, if you should believe him, the US is supposed to negotiate with something like 150 countries in 90 days. I don't think anybody who knows anything about trade believes that that is possible. So what you have is a situation where the United States, day by day, is doing damage to its own economy. And I think if you look at it from the European Union perspective, I would say if I should characterize what von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, is doing, she's actually following the old saying of Napoleon that never interrupt your enemy while he's making mistakes. And for the moment, the EU doesn't really need to do a lot of things because things is going day by day worse and worse for the Americans.
Day by day worse for the Americans, says Ola Agnes. Trump is presenting this as a victory. His team around him say this is what they want. His other countries reverse it, say that they've lowered their demands. We're yet to see which countries called up. We haven't had a list from the White House. But according to reporters, there were advisors desperately worried about the bond markets. They were calling up the extent it would lead to a recession. And it's exposed, fair to say, cracks in the unity of Team Trump, hasn't it?
Well, if he talks about a victory, I don't want to know what a defeat is like. for Donald Trump. Look, I mean, we could go into, and I'm not a finance journalist, into the details, but it changes all the time. What we need to focus on is on the trust completely breaking down at all levels, because it started with Ukraine. Now it's about the economy. And the whole world, I mean, before, US bonds, US stocks, US currency were the sort of basis of the financial system. It was risk-free. A lot of people invested, but now it's not. There's a sort of risk premium on anything Trump touches and on US assets. So investors are going to put their money somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And this is where probably the EU has, something to do and could actually come out on top. But I'm not sure they were prepared for, such radical shock to the system and so quickly. And also it comes and goes. And, at some point you start not following it every hour, because otherwise you become crazy. Everything is happening at the same time. Like China is holding a lot of dollars, right? But they will not need to do so for a very long time. And then it means US consumers are really going to suffer. And so I think Trump said it's a short-term pain for a long-term gain. Well, it looks like a long-term pain and no gain. But everybody loses in a trade war, right?
Not according to Trump.
There's one culprit, it's Trump, but, somehow we will all lose. The EU, however, has a large toolbox and powerful countermeasures that they can use. Will they? We'll see. It all depends whether negotiations fall through or not.
Well, we've so far seen a pause on that, haven't we? There was in the midst of retaliation to the last tariffs. We're looking at steel and on aluminium. It's also worth mentioning that Pete Navarro, senior trade advisor to Trump, told CNN this week that Tesla had relied on cheap foreign parts, and Elon Musk's apparent opposition to tariffs stemmed from his heavy reliance on those foreign parts, saying he's a car assembler, he's not a car maker. So Elon Musk hit back with this. He said, Pete Navarro is truly a moron. And then this, Navarro is dumber than a sack of bricks. And he later apologised, as I said, to the bricks. So it shows you kind of the melting. There's conversations about who might be first to leave the government. The suggestions from inside suggest it might be Pete Navarro. Meanwhile, Lisa, when you're looking at this and you're looking at how the French government is playing this, what's your take?
Well, I think that right now people are still scratching their heads, trying to figure out what actually happened. So there's this one take on it that Donald Trump did this U-turn because he got really worried about the market reaction. But then there's another take that was put forward by Democrats saying there might have been market manipulation. He might have done this on purpose. There was this tweet that he published saying now is a good moment to buy shares. And then he announced this U-turn on the tariff topic. And so he withdrew the tariffs for 90 days and then stock markets went up again. So what really happened, we don't know. I would agree with Agnes, though, to say we have completely lost trust in, whatever he tells us and he can say he promises he will do or won't do.
It's a very good point, actually. There's allegations being made by the Democrats of insider trading, given the moves that Donald Trump made, which he denies. Close allies of his, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, making investments. She again denies any association, but those questions being raised about the timing of that. Meanwhile, let's go to you, Declan, on this, because whilst we're seeing the Chinese retaliation and this kind of brinkmanship between them, does this move strengthen China's hand in Africa and perhaps Russia too, as world leaders on the continent start to consider who are more dependable allies?
Absolutely, yeah. This is seen as another sign of American influence waning on this country. As you said, China's been making huge economic strides here, particularly in the search for required supplies of critical minerals over the last decade or so. Russia has pushed into the Sahel, displacing France and other Western countries. And now we see in large parts of Africa, or in certain parts of Africa, these Trump tariffs they're causing consternation, of course, but they're also seen as a bit of an own goal. The largest single tariff on a country before this round of escalations with China was against the tiny African country of Lesotho, where Trump announced tariffs of 50%. But Lesotho is, one of the few countries in Africa that's actually got a large trade that mostly exports and does trade with the United States rather than Africa. It makes one of the most American products you can think of, denim for Levi's jeans. So, another sign that it's really hard, even here on this continent, to try and make sense, to try and see the logic behind some of these moves.
Back to Lisa's point, isn't it? That you kind of process, it might be gone the next day, it might be cancelled, it might still go ahead. Declan, that's a good point you raise. I want to also mention to Ola as well, you're in Sweden, I think, at the moment, aren't you? Not in Brussels, Ola, but you've been observing quite an interesting moment of comparison this week. Am I right? You've been comparing Greece to the US.
Yes, well, I think both you and I covered the Greek financial crisis a number of years ago, Gavin. And one of the things that we got to be experts in was the interest rate for Greek bonds at the time. And what happened on Wednesday this week was that at a certain moment, the interest rates for 30-year Greek bonds was lower than the interest rate for 30 years US bonds. So if you should put it in a more populist way, you would say that there was higher trust in the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis and his economic policy than in the economic policy of Donald Trump. And just to put this in perspective, the United States is a highly indebted country. And since they keep running a deficit in its finances, it means that they every year have to borrow a lot of money just to pay, just to service the debt that they already have. And if you look for 2025, for this year, the US has to borrow $9,000 billion just to service its debt. Put on top of that what the deficit is going to be. So if suddenly interest rates on that debt increases, it means that it's going to be very expensive for the US. And that's why they freaked out when they saw what happened to the bond market on Wednesday.
Are we going to see Kyriakos Mitsotakis with a red hat with Magaga, I guess it would be, make Greece great again? What a time for him to claim that off the back of with the Greek debt crisis. Ola, very good point, which takes us back to Europe, to Paris, 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon. Demonstrators across the country came out rallying in support of Marine Le Pen. A rally to save democracy, read the placards of protesters. Critics say it was a populist show of force that came about after the far-right National Rally leader and presidential favourite was barred from standing in the 2027 elections and being found guilty of embezzlement of €4 million. Also speaking that day, her replacement candidate, you can see him, 29-year-old Jordan Bardella. His latest polling numbers almost identical to Le Pen's. He seems to be as popular with the heartland, perhaps more so with the youth vote. And other rival runners and riders have been notable in making themselves known this week. Former centrist Prime Minister Gabriel Attal chose Sunday, the same day, to hold his rally. The man widely seen as Emmanuel Macron's protégé smiled at the assembled crowd who chanted Attal, president, over and over again. He's polling third as things stand. And as for the current president, who can't stand again, Emmanuel Macron was the target of a new tell-all book by one of his allies, Yael Braun-Pivet, the president of the lower house of the French Parliament. Here it is, In My Place, released this week. She says she's deeply disappointed by Macron and his method of Macronism. She writes his governing style is an immense deception. It's not at all representative and participatory, but it's top-down, controlled by only those in the president's inner circle. Timing is interesting here. Hasn't confirmed she's running, but there's constant speculation that she will. So, Agnes, let's start with you. And the what and the why of the Warts and All book out yesterday. The allegations that Macron's method is grand deception. What do you make of the allegation and why she's saying it now?
Well, I mean, they're all positioning themselves, so we'll see whether she says she will be running. I mean, 2 years is a very long time in politics. But look, if you look at French presidencies, I mean, it's always top-down. So to accuse a French president of being too much of a French president is, going too far, I think. So yes, President Macron has been not, not presiding with the help of intermediary bodies, as we call them, and he's very much his own man and young, ambitious, energetic. But, he's not so much anymore because, first of all, it's not his government. There's a minority government. He's only now the reason why we see him all the time now is back in the sort of presidential seat and the center of power is because of international politics, and on this he leads. But otherwise, he has little say in domestic politics.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Lisa, given that you covered the Le Pen trial last week. In terms of conversations you've had with those around the Elysée, it seems that the silence of Macron since then is quite notable.
Absolutely. I think, what Marine Le Pen is really tapping into is this feeling that Emmanuel Macron is such a top-down president, and she's trying to represent the people. At the rally, pictures of which we just saw, she was also making a reference to Martin Luther King. And I must say, I'm quite surprised there was not much dwelling on that, because I found it quite extraordinary that he was accused of being and found guilty by a first court, a panel of 3 judges, after years of investigation by dozens of investigators. She was found guilty of being at the center of a system of embezzlement, not just of having...
At the heart of it.
At the heart of it. The judge in that courtroom, she said, she was at the center and she was pulling the strings with authority and determination. Those were her words. And then Marine Le Pen comes out and compares herself to Martin Luther King. Now, Martin Luther King, as you know, he's that civil rights champion, who was fighting against segregation and racism in the 1960s. He won the Nobel Peace Prize and he gave his money, more than $50,000, to the cause at the time. And then he was killed during this fight. She compares herself to him? Really?
Well, it's invoking the spirit of a hero, isn't it? And it seems to be passing off with her supporters, at least, because I spoke to one of the senators this week who said that what was going on was a business administrative misunderstanding, to which, as you've just very clearly said, this was been going on, allegations since 2013. There was party members. Her sister, in fact, was given a fake contract, suggesting she worked for the EU. In fact, she was working in France.
One instance, just to say, there was one assistant who, months after starting his contract, sent an email to the MEP he was supposed to be working for, saying, "Can I come to the European Parliament to visit the Parliament?"
So for the judges, this is hook, line and sinker. Ola, you've covered many French elections, several with Marine Le Pen. You've also reported on Jordan Bardella and the European Parliament. Is he her replacement? And if he is her replacement, what are your reflections of dealing with him, of hearing of him, and the criticism that he's of limited experience?
Well, I've covered a number of French presidential elections, actually, since Chirac got elected in '95, I think. And I've been with Le Pen a couple of times because when our correspondent in Paris always covers the winner, so they normally put me in the place where people are losing. So every time Marine Le Pen is losing an election, I will be the one reporting from that room. I would say, if you look at Bardella, I hope they don't hear that, because then I won't get an accreditation next time. I think, it's very early to see what's going to happen at the next presidential elections, but I would put it this way, that if things continue to be worse and worse in the French economy, that would help even Bardella, who is not that experienced. But if times turn now, then I think you're going to see that it's going to be difficult for a person like Bardella, because it is a protest party, the Rassemblement National.
Well, Interesting fact that if he were to be victorious in 2 years' time, at 31, he'd be the youngest leader in Europe since William Pitt the Younger in the UK. We're going back to a couple of hundred years. I did my maths on that. He was a month younger, in fact, than Sebastian Kurz in Austria when he was Chancellor at 31 as well. Let me move to Declan in Nairobi. Interesting, President Macron was in Egypt this week talking about the situation in Gaza, meeting with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. They went to a Cairo market together. They put tickets in the subway. We saw them having a bit of a banter and a good time. Let's take a look.
في خط المترو الثالث بالقاهرة بفخامة الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي رئيس جمهورية مصر العربية وفخامة الرئيس إيمانويل ماكرون رئيس الجمهورية الفرنسية. إنه لشرف عظيم أن نستقبل ضيفينا الكريمين بمناسبة هذه الزيارة الرئاسية.
Interesting your take on that. This is somebody who's had difficult couple of years in various African countries and relations there. What did you make of his time with al-Sisi?
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. I mean, I think that, you see Egypt as this country that many European countries have struggled to have a solid relationship with in recent years because of the tension between the authoritarian tactics of the Sisi government and Western governments or European governments who are both worried about immigration coming across the Mediterranean. But also you've seen countries like France and Italy striking very large weapon deals with. But, I'll contrast that with another interesting visit that took place in not very far away last month. We saw Marine Le Pen flying over there to meet with President Deby. And really, it was so interesting transposed into Africa. There was a real sense that the visit, at least in part, was for Marine Le Pen to try and stake that position, capitalizing what we're seeing as the failures of Macron. France pulled its troops out of Chad at the end of January. That's something that just a couple of years ago would have been almost unthinkable. Chad was seen as a rock-solid partner for Paris. And so it's interesting to see how these French presidential dynamics or electoral dynamics are playing out here.
Really interesting. Well, it takes us, let's go from France and Egypt to next door to Germany. There's perhaps a serendipity between the significant political events in the US and in the fourth largest economy in the world playing out at the same time, perhaps fortuitously for Berlin being overshadowed by what happens in Washington, because it was back on November the 6th, the day of the US election, that the German government collapsed. The coalition of the centre-left SDP, the Greens, the Free Democrats fell apart over disagreements that had seen the parties trying to keep calm, limp on for a long time. Then came the German elections in February, won by the centre-right CDU, fragmented, once the party of Angela Merkel, now led by the man who was once leaving the party, forced to leave, he says, because of her, Friedrich Merz. After his victory, the coalition building started again. This Wednesday, on the day the White House was announcing its 90-day tariff pause, the German government was announcing a new coalition deal had been reached for Berlin. This is record timing and the promise in keeping made by Mr. Merz to have a deal before Easter. It's known as GroKo Redux, the return of the Grand Coalition. And if there were cheers, they were muted because the news also came out that day that the polls showed the far right, AfD, was for the first time the country's most popular party. This is what Chancellor-to-be Friedrich Merz had to say.
We have a strong plan with which we can move our country forward again. The coalition agreement is the result of intensive consultations and negotiations. Above all, however, it's a very strong and clear signal to the citizens of our country. And it's also a clear signal to our partners in the European Union. Germany is getting a government that is capable of action and has the strength to act.
Lisa, let's start with you in your home country. Talk us through GroKo Redux, the very different parties, what essentially they've agreed to and what the stakes are.
Well, it's not a big outcome, according to many people. And that's also, I think, one reason for that poll you quoted. I looked it up, actually. Today's poll shows that the CDU is ahead again.
So it's a brief eclipse.
Yeah, it was a brief eclipse. Yet many people think that the CDU, the Conservative Party, has given in too much to the SPD, the centre-left party. Obviously, AfD is polling very well, the far-right party, also because they're against immigration, and CDU was trying to take that stance as well. And in that, what we call Koalitionsvertrag, you might like that word, the coalition agreement, they actually talk about immigration, but in a very vague way. They talk about increasing the minimum wage. They talk about tax breaks for company, bringing down expenses, and also, in a way, getting rid of or I'm not actually sure. It's very vague on heating. That is actually, surprisingly, a very important issue in Germany. There is a rule that you have to install heat pumps when you install new heating from a certain point on, and there are subsidies, public subsidies for that until a certain income. And it has been a huge topic of discussion in Germany, that very particular law, and this government apparently will come back at least partly on that, but it's not quite clear how.
But it often comes to the nitty-gritty, the domestic politics, what puts more money back in your pocket, what makes your home warmer as well. Ola, you've covered German politics for a number of years, fluent German speaker as well. When you look at this coalition, when you look at Friedrich Merz's place in Europe, what sort of figure do you see?
Well, two points. I think the most important thing in the German negotiations was actually what happened before they even started negotiating for real, which was when they changed the debt rate, because that is what all of Europe, or a big part of Europe, has been looking forward to, is for Germany to take the lead in Europe. And Germany has been hesitant to that. And I mean, if you look at the reign of Angela Merkel, her way of acting in Europe prolonged the financial crisis and the economic crisis that we had when she was the chancellor. So everybody's looking forward to see whether Friedrich Merz will actually take the lead. Now he has, unchained himself financially so that Germany can take the lead financially. Is Germany going to do that also militarily, politically? Because if Germany takes the lead, then you're going to see France and others follow, and then suddenly you're going to see a completely different EU to what you've seen for the last century.
And I see the SDP managed to bag themselves 7 cabinet positions as well. They've not done bad for a party that's performed its worst at any election. Listening to Ola, Agnes, when Friedrich Merz says Germany is back, it's a message to Donald Trump, back in play, back on a world stage, back in Europe. If that's the case, how long have they been off stage and where have they been?
Well, I think about 3 years.
AWOL.
And yes, stagnation. I mean, the economy. I mean, they were sort of jolted back into action by the situation in Ukraine, and also Trump arriving and saying, well, we're not your friends anymore. And the EU, cannot do with a weak Germany. And France needs a strong partner. And this is what had been lacking in the last 3 years. And remember, President Macron was, did a lot of work with Angela Merkel, because, that 1 trillion euros and the end of fiscal discipline, well, it started, remember, with COVID, when President Macron managed to convince Angela Merkel to agree on that EU joint borrowing of 800 billion euros. That was the beginning of the, sort of paradigm shift in the German mentality. And now there's no other choice. And France and Germany need to be on the same page with, their European partners. But if they are not working together, then, the EU is weaker as a result.
Well, a common problem in an unreliable US president might just help that. And is a good point, which takes us to Africa, to Sudan, almost 2 years to the day that the civil war started, when 2 rival military forces, 2 Rival military leaders, once allies, turned on each other in a catastrophic power struggle. It began in the capital, Khartoum, with heavy gunfire, explosions and airstrikes in densely packed neighbourhoods. Early in the morning, by the afternoon, the paramilitary Rapid Support Force had captured the airport and the presidential palace. In the 2 years since, the conflict has become the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, according to the UN. 12 million, at least, displaced. 4 million flee abroad. Declan Walsh at the New York Times, as we heard, he's covered the crisis extensively in that time, telling the story, its complexities in the face of immense risk. When the Sudanese army recaptured key parts of the capital, including the presidential palace, exactly 3 weeks ago, Declan, alongside the photojournalist Ivor Pickett, followed shortly after, the first Western journalist inside the centre of the city, and this is what he saw.
Entire swaths of the city have been reduced to a ghost town, with destroyed buildings and soldiers wandering uneasily about with hardly any civilians. Tens of thousands of people who were sheltering in Khartoum have now been shifted to transit camps in the north. There's no electricity in most of the city, the water is out, and in the handful of hospitals that are still operating, desperate conditions prevailed. In many parts of the city, there's a huge sense of relief that the RSF has withdrawn. We met residents who told us how RSF soldiers went on the rampage in the last days before the army moved in.
3 people were lying there on the ground.
Declan, you've talked about revenge killings going on in plain sight while you were there. We heard from some of those pointing to it. To what extent is there any civil life or sense of civil society coming back to Khartoum while you were there?
Unfortunately, it's probably far too early to talk about that. The entire centre of the city, as you saw in some of that footage, has pretty much been laid waste. All the buildings of power, of history, of culture. We went to the National Museum that had been looted, 5-star hotels that were in ruins, and large parts of the city where nobody is living because the conditions are so terrible. So, I think the first challenge for the Sudanese military, since they've swept back in some weeks ago and pushed the RSF almost entirely out, is, whether this is going to be some sort of Pyrrhic victory for them. It's certainly a turning point in the course of this war. It's pushed the RSF out to the west and the south. But they're now in charge of this capital city that is in ruins, and it's very hard to know where the money is going to come to start rebuilding it. And of course, as soon as that starts, then you also have those questions you referred to. What's the political future? Is there a political future ahead, or are there political talks ahead? But unfortunately, for now, the diplomatic space is very limited. There's little sign that either side in this war want to turn to talks.
Well, I remember a few months back on the programme we were talking about the Biden administration, about meetings going on in Switzerland, trying to bring about some kind of peace, which kind of fell apart. The Sudanese army didn't turn up for that. How do you think? Well, two things really. How is Trump dealing with Sudan? And the other point you make on taking Khartoum, I understand that Turkey was a big factor in its help, its support for drones. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, drones are playing a huge role in this war on both sides. In fact, when we went to the presidential palace the day after it fell, or it was taken by the military, there was a drone strike that killed a team of local journalists and a senior military officer who, in fact, had been the liaison we'd been dealing with, and we'd spoken to him just briefly before, and he was hit in a drone strike outside that palace. So that was a real reminder how, on the one hand, you have the United Arab Emirates that's been helping the RSF, certainly helping them with powerful drones we've reported on. And then on the other side, you have Turkey, Iran. They've supplied drones to the Sudanese military. Russia's also been supplying them with weapons. And that's one of the another complicating factor in this war, that it's not only about two Sudanese sides, it's also about now the interests of all these outside countries that have taken sides and that are, complicating efforts to solve it.
Yeah, outside players. No, go on. Yes.
Sorry, just on the diplomatic front, the Americans and President Trump have given no indication really, whether they're going to take any interest in this conflict at all. The main impact so far has been these huge cuts to American aid that certainly from late January on, when foreign aid was frozen, had an immediate impact on the ground. And when we were there, we went into places, soup kitchens that had been funded by the US until a few months earlier, and they've been forced to close with devastating impacts for hungry people on the ground.
Declan, it's been a delight having you on tonight. Your expert insight, unique analysis from all our panellists. In fact, thank you. Our Chief Africa Correspondent for the New York Times, Declan Walsh, describing life inside Khartoum. Ola Ryberg, the EU Correspondent for Danish Public Broadcaster, DR. And with me in the studio, the critically acclaimed award-winning author and broadcaster Agnès Poirier, and Sudan, Paris independent journalist Lisa Lewis. Thank you for watching in a week that marks the 100th-year anniversary of a cultural classic, April the 10th, 1925, when the New York publishing house Scribner's first published F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. A dud, said the New York Evening World. No more than a glorified dime novel, said the Chicago Tribune, and it sold fewer than 20,000 copies. Today considered a literary masterpiece, it sells almost 500,000 copies a year. And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. See you in 7 days for The World next week.